So just really basic ideas. Water and then jumping in. So the hazard would be water and then jumping in is the actual risk that you're taking when you go in. The same for gasoline and then lighting a fire. Fire, gasoline, explosion. Not so good. So you gotta like learn what risks are and then what hazards are as well. So risk theory. So there's three different ones. Perceived risk, real risk, and absolute risk. I'm just going to quickly talk about them before I go into the actual risk assessment. So perceived risk is the level of risk that someone thinks about. So, for example, all of us in this room here probably have a different perceived risk to other people that wouldn't be so into the outdoors. Like, the example I use is like my dad, thinking when I go out windsurfing or whatever, he might think it's really dangerous and stuff because the wind is super strong and everything, but my like perceived risk is a lot lower because I think, oh man, it's going to be good, it's blasting, it's going to be fine. So the perceived risk for the actual journey that perceives stuff is the difference between the parents thinking going out for 2 days on a hiking trip versus the kids. The kids probably thought it was all great, but then the adults would experience. But the parents might have still been a little bit skeptical. So that was just the perceived risk. The absolute risk is the real risk without any safety precautions. So if you go up, climbing up a mountain with no harness, no ropes, no nothing, that's the absolute risk. So that's like the worst possible thing. And then the real risk is when you have the absolute risk and then having safety features. So think about the difference between climbing a rock face with no equipment, no ropes, no nothing, and then the real risk when you have a harness, ropes, someone belaying you, it's completely different. So you kind of just got to gauge what's what, think about it before you go out, what's the real risk, because that's the one that's actually the most important to us. Okay, for the three main things that affect people, so people obviously. So if you have inexperienced people, like new students, people who are a bit nervous, these are things that will affect the level of risk and the level of hazard that you're going to witness. Equipment. So of course, good equipment makes everything a lot safer, more secure. It'll also put a bit of peace of mind in the students' heads. So I think having good equipment and then showing equipment to your class and stuff is a really good idea. And then last, the weather. The weather is the one thing that you can't really control at all. You can check weather forecasts, you can do everything, but once it comes down to it, the weather does what the weather wants. So you always have to have a backup plan when you're thinking of things because the weather is the one thing that you're not going to be able to control. And later on I'm going to talk about what happens. They actually planned for the other things, they had people, they had equipment, but the weather was the thing that really got them. So this is the Cairngorms, 30 years ago, a dark time. So when was it? It was in November 1971, so it was a long time ago. Mountaineering gear probably wasn't the same standard as it was today, but they had a pretty good understanding of what to do, what not to do. So in Scotland, what was it? It was an overnight trip for a school class that they were taking out just to teach them about a bit of navigational skills, using maps, using a compass. So there was 14 students from Allison Park School in Edinburgh, and then there was two leaders, Davison and Betty. They were the people that were kind of looking after each group, so the group was split up into two, one slightly more advanced and one slightly less. And then why? Why did it all happen? So the weather was the real thing that got everyone, because they planned it for having a little bit of snow, and then when the big level of snow came in and strong winds and stuff, the kids didn't know what to do and they didn't have the willpower to keep going and trying to like fight through the tough weather to get to the end. So that was one of the things that actually really affected. And then the level of training from the actual leaders wasn't up to scratch. So these are just some of the photos of what sort of terrain it was like. As you can see, really open, beautiful 1 minute, and then super cloudy the next. So it's like weather can just roll in out of nowhere, and then people are in trouble just like that. It's quite a dangerous mountain range for this reason. So this is where they start, or this is where the scene is. Over here, if you want to read it, it's not that important. That's just their route plan. So they actually did a lot of things right in terms of planning a route, making sure they got it, bringing maps and everything. But the main thing that they did wrong was they underestimated the kids' fitness. So they thought the kids would be able to walk at a faster pace than they would. and they thought that they'd be more willing and determined to walk and keep up the high level. And the last thing was they got their timings wrong. So they thought they'd finish at 5, but realistically, if they did everything correctly, weren't stopping for too long, they'd be finishing around 5:30 and 6. And when at that point it's already getting dark, and it's not a good place to be in the mountains without the right gear in the dark. So just some of the mountaineering guidelines that I had to look up. So for ratios, it's 1 to 10 with the mountain leader, and then 1 to 5 with a trainee leader. So both the leaders weren't actually qualified in anything, which is one of the things I think came down to it and put them in a lot of trouble because they didn't know what to do in certain situations. Yes, they both had experience in the mountains, but they weren't qualified to take a group, which I think was a bit negligent of the school to allow them to take out the kids. Listen, that happens. So from Mountaineering Ireland, I looked it up and I said, what do people take in a day's hiking? So these are the things that Mountaineering Ireland say you need. So a map, obviously, compass, extra clothing, all that. But they were going for an overnight trip, and they didn't bring a lot of these things because, once again, it was 30 years ago. So there's a bit of lenience for that, but still, they should have brought definitely a group shelter or a tent just in case something goes wrong like it did. Can anyone else think of anything that they should be bringing with them on the mountains if they're taking a group out that's not on this list here that you think is pretty essential?
Phone.
A phone?
Oh, phone 30 years ago.
Phone, a radio though, something like that, yeah.
Means of communication.
Just something for communication. I thought that was the main thing that I was surprised was missing, was some form of communication, just in case anything turned a little bit sour. What did they do right? So there was a lot of good things that they did, and there was a lot of things that you're going to have to learn from. They did look at the way they're going. They did make a route plan. So they did have the right level of preparation. They did have an emergency plan, so they checked it out. They had a backup plan. If the snow or the weather turned, they were going to cut down and go straight to the hut. Unfortunately, only one of the two groups followed the emergency plan. So I think this is one of the cases where it shows planning for an emergency and then trusting your plan is really important. So if you have an emergency plan, go for it, and you've thought about it when you're in a sane, safe place, and you've logically thought about it. So make sure you trust your emergency plan. That's one of the things I learned from it. They checked the weather forecast, and on the day they looked at it. The weather wasn't perfect, but as they spent like a couple of weeks organizing it, the leaders thought between them, it's okay, it's a safe way to go. So they actually took it. Davison had the group taking bearings, and she was checking them after. So I think that's another important thing as leaders and stuff. We sometimes fall in a safe place, we don't really check what's happening. But Davison was actually checking the bearings after, so they were all doing most of the things correctly, and they packed the right gear. They borrowed gear from one of the adventure centres that was close to the Caragons, and so they had all the gear that they more or less needed, bar from group shelter, a tent, and like a phone. But like in terms of snow gear, they did have it with knee-length canvas, gaiters, ice axes. They had more or less everything. What went wrong? So the leaders' qualifications. They didn't have their mountain leader. They didn't even have their mountain skills. So taking kids out into the mountains that they didn't really know anything about, without any qualifications, I think was a bit naive and kind of a bit optimistic of just hoping everything goes well. They planned the hike, and it was too long. It was just too long for a group of kids going out for their first hike. I don't think you should be trying to push them as much as they did, which is like, do it in small baby steps. Take them time at a time. And then they lacked experience when the bad situation comes. It's all easy being a good mountain leader or whatever when the weather's perfect and stuff, but it's actually when the weather gets bad that you learn what to do, what not to do. It's where the men are made and the boys are left behind, sort of style. So you have to be super cautious. Come on. So you have to be super cautious of just knowing yourself, and when the weather gets bad, just staying calm and just relax, because that's what one of the groups did, and it ended up saving 7 people's lives by just staying calm, thinking about it rationally, and then following the plans they've made. And so one of the groups didn't trust the emergency plan, and that was one of the things that went horribly wrong. So there was two groups, Betty's group and Davidson's. For Betty's group, he led them to the weather turned for the worst, and then he took the emergency plan, and he went straight for the hut, the first hut. He didn't try and finish anything. He took compass bearings, and he brought the whole hut, or the whole group there. After a night in the hut, the first hut, without having Davidson's group, the snow was so hard that they were kind of buried into the hut, and they had to push the snow open. So as you can imagine, if they're having to push a door full of snow away, you can only imagine what's out if you're sleeping outside in that said snow. And then so the next day, they took the group and they walked to the next hut. And then they let the mountain rescue know at 4:30. So at this point, it's already been over 24 hours, 27 hours more or less, that the group's been outside and hiking with no one knowing that they're even in any trouble. So people know that they're going up on this hike, but no one knows. So after 27 hours, then people finally figured out, okay, we need to do something. For Davidson's group, when the weather turned, she thought she had compass bearings for the same hut that Betty went to, but she didn't think they'd make it. So what she did, she stopped, she got everyone in their sleeping bags, put on all their clothes and stuff, and then she thought the best idea was to stay there and to try and keep morale high and singing and stuff, when realistically, if they just follow the compass bearings, they would have made the hut and be okay. So after the night, the snow was falling super high. They actually got stuck in a pocket of snow. So the area they camped in was one of the areas where the snowstorm had hit the worst. So they kind of got pretty unfortunate with stopping as well. If they just continued on, they would have either made it out of the area with super dense snow and gone into somewhere that's not so heavy, or made the hut. But because they stopped and they thought they could survive the night, it didn't turn out so well. The weather. So at the start of the day, the weather was mediocre. It was windy, it was snowy, but it was nothing that they couldn't deal with. But after lunch, midday, the weather came in, and one of the worst blizzards of the mountain's history came in. So I don't know about you guys, but if you've ever been any strong wind with snow, it's pretty miserable. So the worst blizzard of a mountain's history, when it's your first time on the mountain, is going to be pretty hard to kind of stay positive and optimistic about it. And that was one of the things that actually let them down, was just in the end, some of the kids just giving up and letting themselves roll over. The outcomes. So, like I said, the mountain rescues were let know late afternoon on the Sunday. So they couldn't even go out on the Sunday. So that meant that there was another night where all the kids and the leaders that were out there had to sleep rough for another night. Davison actually did try and go and find rescue. She left the group and she tried to go find rescue, but she only made it 50 meters. So she ended up making it 50 meters because the weather was that bad from the group when she was found separately before the actual group. So the mountain rescue found her first, and then from there she was able to give very little direction, but help the mountain rescuers find the rest of her group. So there was 50 men out on a chopper looking for these kids in the worst snow blizzard of the history. So eventually in the late afternoon of the Monday, the group were found, and they were kind of pulling up bodies from being buried alive essentially. So the snow had fallen up to 1.2 meters the kids were under. So they were finding some kids that were buried. That's like my height of snow. They were digging kids out. So imagine being in that sort of snow for 2 days, and then pretty much all of them went, unfortunately, bar from one. There was one kid who was still breathing when they pulled him out. He was actually the last person to be pulled out of the snow, and he was treated on site, he was heli evacuated out of there, and he survived. So he had frostbite, hypothermia, but he was one of the luckier ones who got out of there. Because there's 6 others that didn't make it. So then they had a remembrance in this little church here on the 28th of November in 1971. The disaster was described to be worst in mountain here are that the disaster has often been described as Britain or Scotland's worst mountaineering tragedy. I would consider Ireland in this category of the worst that I've ever heard about. It's 6 young people's lives just gone when they're probably just at the peak of when they're going to learn. So I think it's incredibly sad, but there's also a lot of things that we can learn because they did a lot of things right, don't get me wrong, just the weather really got them. So recommendation, for me looking at this and kind of thinking about it, I definitely say have the leaders with more qualifications. There's no point taking groups out if you're not qualified, just in case something goes wrong like it did, and just no one had the head to keep it cool. Different and easier location. There's no point in taking a group of kids out on one of like the harder mountains to start off with unpredictable weather, rough terrain. So I think start off light, and if they still enjoy it and they want to come back for more, then you can start progressing and moving up the ranks of mountains. Taking better gear or just extra gear. So taking that group shelter. Doesn't weigh that much in your bag, but I think group shelter would have definitely been able to bring everyone together, keep them warm, morale can be kind of lifted if they're all in a safe little dome. So I think that would have really helped their chances of surviving. And then communications, so just a radio, a flare, anything would have been better than nothing. Going into the mountains on your own with no backup options for society, I think is just bizarre. And then a shorter trek, of course, so it's once again the students, there's no point in pushing them so much on their very first trek. It's like asking a beginner to go out learn windsurfing in force 6 winds. There's no point. No one's gonna learn anything from it, apart from be scared. So, and sadly, that's the way it is. And then 30 years ago, of course, safety equipment is better now. There is more source communications, but unfortunately, that's not what we were dealing with back then. And then the mountaineering guidelines. So, stars they didn't have the qualifications, and then they were taking out groups that were just too big to control, I think. So maybe if they had another couple of adults to deal with the situation, they would have been able to formulate a more logical plan to get off the mountain. So then I was just looking at the minimum risk theory and acceptable risk theory. I think this was the safe point that you should be looking to aim at, where it's not too high, it's not too risky, there's a little bit of kind of adrenaline going in if you want. But I think they were going up here because they were doing it at a bad time of year when the weather is known to change quite a lot, and they weren't prepared enough for what could happen. So, any questions on that one?
What ages were they?
They were 12 and up. So like it was like 14 and up. So it was like transition year sort of age students going as part of the Duke and Edinburgh Award, I believe. So it was like really kind of could have been us sort of style back in the day.
Yeah.
Any more?
So the leader that was bringing the second group out there, that stuff, did the leader survive?
No.
The leader died as well?
Leader died, yeah. She was alive when the mountain rescue found her, but she didn't make it off the mountain alive, unfortunately.
Leo, you opened that door, did you ever look up? Oh, that Leo, did you ever look up at him?
I saw his picture, but I didn't really want to get too much into his detail. But all I know is he survived hypothermia and frostbite on his hands and feet, I think.
Did he kill us or
I'd say he has an incredible story. I'd say it's quite a sad one,
as
though.
a guest speaker?
Fly him in from Scotland.
Family already, you know.
That's that.
So the first group survived
Yeah.
completely.
So the first group who actually followed the emergency plan.
Yeah.
So when the weather turned, they took their compass bearings, go straight to the hut, and the hut actually, surprisingly enough, didn't get hit with that much snow compared to other parts of the mountain. So that's what I was reading up, that the hut was in one of the areas with less snow, and the door was still caved over. So that just kind of shows the scale of how much snow was falling over quite a short period of time. And now, perfect. Thank you very much.